The oboe and the English horn are both double reed instruments, and they're related to one another. Now, the oboe has got a very nasal sound, and it's a beautifully expressive melodic instrument, but doesn't work great as a blend in sections. And it's often used for that reason as a solo instrument. The range is from B3 to G6. So kind of nasal, but can be very lovely sounding. Now, we have the usual sorts of articulations, and for this one, we don't have a flutter tonguing, but for example, the trill, like we saw in the last video, is a useful one to be able to modulate into once you've got a note held. That's a major second. And depending on the articulation you use, you could control the vibrato manually with the mod wheel in this particular instrument, or whatever controller assignment you want to use for that if your instrument has control over vibrato. Let me turn this all the way down. Now, a lot of the articulations have a kind of auto vibrato in them, so you don't need it. But if you want to control it manually, it's nice to have that facility. And similarly for dynamics, some of the articulations have a kind of swell built in to the sampling, but it's also nice to be able to use something like the expression pedal to ramp up and control it manually. You can really control it like that. Now, here I'm going to play you a simple exercise with piano and oboe, and you'll hear the kind of expressive quality that it has. Here's a look at the articulations, and this is the melody on top. And there's a lot of articulations in here that are related to sustain, because those are the most common kinds of playing styles that we use with oboe, long sustained tones, or some short ones, of course. But there's lots of variations on those. So let's look and listen. You can see the articulations here. So that works nicely. Now, let's say I wanted to use some expression pedal to overlay some dynamics on that. I can do it. Now, it's not going to work with every articulation, so it's going to switch around based on what's used, but this dynamic expression, short and long, for example, is one that works nicely with crossfades. But let's play this again, and I'm going to record in some expression, and you can see and hear the movement with this slider here. So that worked nicely. There was one switch that didn't work so well because it jumped to a note at a higher velocity, but that's easily adjustable. There's the playback there. That was the jump that didn't work. There's the mod wheel movement. Now, the English horn is a bit bigger. It's a transposing instrument. It's pitched a fifth lower, and this is the range. So it's got a bit of a darker sound. And here's that same exercise with the English horn, and you'll hear the similar kind of expressive melodic quality, but just a slightly darker tone. Yeah, that articulation right there is the one that didn't work, and I would change that one. In fact, let me do it right now in the key switches, and you can see me do that. And it's just a matter of manually going in. Now, every different DAW has different systems for entering key switches. I'm doing them here in a way that you can see them that translates onto all systems. But for example, Logic Pro has a built-in articulation ID system. Cubase has expression maps. These are more elegant ways of handling key switching or articulation switching rather than having to draw in key switch notes manually. But this should correct this one. And let's just bring the velocity down of that note. There we go. As you can see, different articulations use different ways of managing the dynamics. Most of them are based on keyboard velocity, but some on that with a combination of the crossfade or an auto crossfade. And as with the oboe, having notes transition to trills is stylistically fairly common. We'll continue with more in the next video. Next up in the woodwind section is the clarinet. Now, they're a transposing instrument, and they're usually pitched in B flat, and they sound a major second higher than written. But we also have E flat clarinets that sound a minor third higher than written. But B flat clarinets are the more traditional ones. Now, I don't want to get too hung up with the range of these instruments, particularly these woodwind instruments in this video, because they vary depending on sample libraries. And even with real players, some of the instruments vary, and also playing techniques allow them to get extended ranges, sometimes with harmonics. But this is a pretty typical, useful, kind of workable range, although I don't want to say it's written in stone, because it certainly depends, in our case as MIDI orchestrators, on the sample library that we're using. From C up to an E flat. Now, stylistically, these also utilize flutter tonguing, and trills are common with this instrument. And again, in this particular software instrument, we have MIDI continuous controllers to morph into those articulations. Now, when we look at the articulations, again, we have a variety of sustains, flutter tonguing, and short notes. And again, more advanced or sophisticated software instrument libraries will have not just key switches, but kind of momentary key switches where you can play a note and then hold another one down as a temporary key switch. Here they're called hotkeys, and then release it and it reverts back. Now, for example, here I have the dynamic expressive. But if I hit, let's say, a G sharp 1, I can morph into the trill and then release it and come back. And there I hit an A1, which is great for a vibrato going down. So you can get a very expressive type of performance, and we have vibrato up as well. So useful to explore these kinds of momentary key switches. And again, they're called different things in different libraries. Here they're hotkeys, but momentary key switch as opposed to permanent is useful. Here it's called while hold as well. I don't want to go too deep into the details of any one particular instrument because that's not what this series is about. It's about orchestration in general, but these are generally applicable principles, the idea of a permanent key switch versus a temporary toggle or momentary key switch. Now, we also have the bass clarinet, which is another member of the clarinet family, and it's also pitched in B flat. And again, some sample libraries give an extended range. And in this case, it sounds a major ninth lower than it's written. And it's typically the lowest voice in the woodwind section. So this is typically a usable range. And again, shorts and longs are pretty typical with this, especially those long sustained low notes. And what's interesting is that it's pretty useful up high for staccato or rapid passages, but down low, there's less facility on the instrument to move around quickly. So let me just call up the bass clarinet here. And again, we have flutter tonguing and trills and different legato transitions, typical kind of playing components that we're used to seeing. And again, similar types of articulations. Won't go through them all. Now we have the bassoon next. And this is a double reed instrument like the oboe, and it's got a very nasal sound, but it's much lower. It's a non-transposing instrument, so it's written in C. And again, the ranges vary depending on the playing style of the player, and in our case, the sample library. And again, considering its size, it's good for faster passages in the higher end of the range. And this is an idea of what it sounds like from low to high. So very evocative sound and familiar in orchestral type of work. Now, I want to look at a little exercise utilizing these sounds. And here's a little motif. I'm adding flute onto this, but a simple motif. So I want to orchestrate that with flute, clarinet, bass clarinet, and solo bassoon. So here are the parts. Just before I play it, we'll look briefly at them. Some long notes, some short. And again, I'm doing this to sort of demonstrate the articulations. Some rapid passages on the bass clarinet and the bassoon here in the higher ends of their registers. And I've got some key switch notes in. Again, here you can see the key switches on the bottom, playable range on top, key switches on the bottom. And here I'm using a short articulation for most of this. And here a few different articulations as well. Now here you can see the 4 different parts, and we'll follow along as I play it. And then again, this is an exercise to demonstrate the articulations. I haven't programmed in expression for dynamics, which would add another nuance and layer of detail to the performance. But let's listen to this as is. Now, you'll notice that the flute and clarinet are a really nice double to thicken up the texture. Let me play this again. I'm just going to solo the flute for a moment. I'll add in the clarinet. Now, it's in a different range, but it still thickens up the texture. So there's a little introduction to clarinet, bass clarinet, and bassoon. So the clarinet creates a very evocative, expressive feeling, and it's great when it's playing with other woodwind instruments like we heard with the flute. The bass clarinet's the lowest of the section, and there's usually only one in an orchestral setup. And ironically, it kind of cuts through because it's so much lower and kind of got that nasal quality. And the bassoon is a double reed instrument like the oboe, again in the lower range, similar to the bass clarinet, and they kind of serve similar duties in the orchestra. Bass clarinet and bassoon are great for rapid passages in their higher ranges. And the ranges of all these instruments depend on the sample library you're using. Some have extended ranges, as do some real instruments and real performance techniques. We'll see you for more in the next video. The trumpet is the highest register instrument in the brass section, and it goes from roughly an E to a high C. And I say roughly because a lot of this is dependent on the player's technique. More than any instrument in the orchestra, the embouchure, the muscles in the mouth, and their technique with that enables them to go higher sometimes and sometimes not as high. I'd say this is the highest usable end of the register, meaning that you can be sure that 9 out of 10 players will be able to play it cleanly. So I'm going to go higher than that. It's pitched in B flat, and it sounds a minor seventh higher than written. And it's got flutter tongue articulations. And again, vibrato. It's good to control that via MIDI. Let's go for a longer articulation here. And again, it's assigned to mod wheel here. So you can get a nice lyrical, expressive type of performance with that. And again, in this particular instrument, we can control the speed of the vibrato. And legato transitions are also a thing with trumpet and all brass instruments. The way, when I say a thing, I mean the way they transition from one note to another when the notes are programmed to overlap. So you can hear those scoops down. And of course, here you can control the speed of that transition, but this feels pretty natural. And listen when the notes aren't overlapping. They're tongued separately. So overlapping gives a nice smooth transition with good legato transitions programmed up. Now here, in terms of articulations, we have the usual sustains and dynamic, expressive, long and short, but we have crescendos as well, which are interesting. So for example, I can play a long note and hold this, or press this to switch to it. And that's also called a forte piano or a sforzando, where you get a strong attack, it dies down and then swells back up. Now, of course, this is programmable with an expression pedal or CC11 or volume automation, but this is a natural representation of how players play that. And then we have various short articulations. And they'll get shorter. And rips are common in brass instruments. They can do that, and falls as well. Now we have trombone next, and this is a lower ranged instrument, and it's played with a movable slide. So rather than a valve where you press your fingers down, you move a slide. So the position of the slide is what determines the pitch, that along with the embouchure, the mouth muscles. That's usually written in bass or tenor clef. I'm demonstrating it here in bass and treble. Since we're not really focused on notation, I'd want to make it more focused on readability. So I'm using piano type clef here with bass and treble, so you can see it more clearly. But this is the typical range. And it sounds nice in the upper range. And here as well, we get some flutter tonguing possibilities. And vibrato. Go again for a longer articulation. And legato transitions. And here with a long transition, you'll hear more of the transition between the notes when they're overlapping. So it's very characteristic to the instrument, but let's leave it at short for now. And it's a natural transition where the notes are not tongued separately when they overlap. And by tongued, it's a playing technique where they have an attack for each note that's based on the movement and use of the tongue. So let's look at the articulations. There's not as many here. Some sustains, the crescendo, the short, and again, the falls and the rips. So we can get this kind of thing. Now, next up, we have bass trombone, which is a lower version, and it goes from B flat down low up to approximately an F, and again, based on embouchure. And related to that, we have the euphonium. Now, in a way, it is and it isn't related. I'm going to switch to this instrument, and in the euphonium, it's a valved instrument. It's more like a tuba, so it's not like a trombone with a slide, but more like a tuba and trumpet with valves. But I say like a bass trombone because it plays in a similar kind of low range and serves the same kind of function as the low end of the orchestra. And here as well, we have flutter tonguing, vibrato, legato, those types of articulation. And one new one we haven't seen before. A lot of higher end instruments will have a script for when you want to play repeated notes, you hold one note and it'll play repetitions triggering different samples. This is called round robin, so that you're not getting the same note all the time. And here it says repetitions 16th notes. So there's a little bit of realistic variation by using different samples of the same note. And then we have flutter tonguing for the effect on euphonium. A nice sharp attack, which is useful for this instrument. And then crescendos and various sustained and short notes. So it goes down low. Now here I've got a little exercise using trumpet, trombone, and euphonium together. You can follow along the parts here, but let's start by looking at the articulations, and you can see the key switches here and the performances here. And you'll see if you zoom in, I paid a lot of attention to where and when the notes overlap and when they don't, when I want to get those legato transitions. And you'll notice some of the notes don't fall right on the grid so as to get some natural human variation between the players. And here it is. So you can hear the instruments in the different parts of their ranges doing short and longer articulations. There are two more instruments I want to look at in the brass section. The first is the French horn. This is what it looks like, and this is what it sounds like. It's also referred to as the horn, and it goes from B all the way up to an F5. It's a transposing instrument. Again, we're not so concerned with that unless we're copying out the parts for a live orchestra, but as MIDI orchestrators, we're just going to work in concert pitch. But technically is a transposing instrument, so it's written a fifth higher than it sounds. And they're often used for sustain chords and pad type parts. We have multiple horn players in a brass section in an orchestra, and we're going to look soon at the ensemble versions of all these instruments. And it's a strong, bright instrument in the upper range, and it's a bit flabby sounding down low. And it can be played with or without a mute. And as far as articulations, we have, first of all, the usual flutter tonguing and vibrato. So a subtle amount can go a long way. And we have the usual sustains and shorts, and we have rips and falls. Now we have the tuba, which is the lowest instrument in the orchestra. And it's a non-transposing instrument, so it's written in the bass clef, and it goes really low. It goes from D1, which is way below the staff, up until G4, and it's displayed as G3 here due to my software. It's got a rich, warm sound. It's versatile, plays nicely at quiet volumes as well as loud volumes. It's a big instrument, and so requires a lot of breath. So there's usually a lot of rests in the parts. And as far as articulations, sustains, shorts, and there's a lot of sound effect type of things. There's an effect. Here's an effect. It's good for unusual kinds of sounds like that, but this is what the nature of the sound is like. And here's a little example of brass choir, trumpet, solo trombone, solo French horn, and solo tuba. And let's just look here at the articulations. I've got my playable range up high, and then, as usual, my key switch notes at the bottom. That's the tuba. That's the French horn part. There's some staccato notes up high, and then trombone. Now, on trumpet, what I did was I added in some expression. So with the expression pedal controlling the dynamics, we got some nice swells. And just the expression on this one part, it comes in with long notes about halfway through, you'll hear how expressive and more nuanced the performance is. And of course, this can be used and should be used on all the parts. But here it is, adding nice subtlety to the dynamics in the trumpet part. And I played this in with my expression pedal. And here are the four parts. A little bit of a low voicing with the resolution. And short notes on tuba. Comes the trumpet. Little French horn solo at the end there. So that's a little introduction to the French horn and tuba. Orchestral percussion can bring a lot of dynamics and shape and contour and accents and emphasis to your orchestrations. Now, we generally think of percussion in two broad categories, pitched and non-pitched. Now, in non-pitched percussion, which we're going to look at here, often you'll have one mapping in one instrument with several different percussion instruments. For example, here's concert kick drum, snare drum, the snare drum roll, toms, sleigh bells, tambourine with rolls, other various percussion. wood blocks. That's a pair of handheld concert crash cymbals, and they can be muffled as well. It's also common to play them with mallets and do a roll for a swell or crescendo, and this is great for emphasizing crescendos. Like that, and you'll often find various speeds of rolls. We have triangle, and other kinds of guiras, another hand percussion. Now, I don't want to go in too much detail here because every library is a little bit different in terms of the mapping. Now, in terms of notation, we often have accents indicated, and these double lines indicate rolls. And we often have a drum staff. Right now, I'm just showing it on a treble clef down here, but there's a bass drum part, cymbal, that's a roll icon or roll articulation marking, another one for the triangle, and there are some tom hits. So here's a little simple percussion part with snare, bass drum, cymbals, triangle, and toms. So you heard how the toms and the snare did a little kind of question and answer, call and response kind of thing with the triangle doing a roll underneath. So you can create drama and tension and mood with percussion. Now here is another simple percussion arrangement along with some accompaniment. Now I'm going to play what I have here. I have trumpet and clarinet playing in thirds and French horn doing some crescendos and some short tuba notes. Let's start by just listening to this. In thirds, tuba, French horn swells, trumpet. Now, let me add in the percussion, and I want to just call these up to show you what they look like. Here, this is a traditional kind of percussion or drum clef. We don't use treble and bass clef, but they're with a definable number of lines where the different lines represent the different instruments. So let's look and listen to this all together. Snare. Triangle roll. And it ends with a bass drum hit and a short tuba note. Let's just listen to this one more time without the score and concentrate or focus on the percussion and how it's reinforcing what's going on with these instruments. Little intro with the cymbal swell. There are a variety of tuned percussion instruments that fill out the percussion section and are very useful for orchestration, again, for accents and support, and they also have a lot of personality that poke through. Now, we have the timpani drums, also called the kettle drums, and they're usually hit with a mallet, and we can roll them like that kind of thing. And we often have software instruments where the rolls are programmed, so you don't need to actually play them in. You can just hit one note and get a programmed roll, depending on the library you're using. And they can be muffled with the player using their hands. And these are the typical ranges of the different timpani drums. They come in different sizes, and they are tuned via a pedal. And they can be slid up so you can hear the pitch transition. And then they get in the higher range. Now, next up, we have the glockenspiel. And this is a really interesting instrument. It cuts through in the orchestra. It's very high pitched in timbre and in range. It's 2.5 octaves, and it's written very high, but it sounds even higher than that. It's typically played with hard mallets and sounds a bit like this. That's the low end of the range. It goes very high. Now we have xylophone, and these are all kind of the mallet percussion family. And they typically have a 3.5 octave range. They can sound an octave higher than written, and they're usually played also with mallets, usually hard mallets. And they have a very staccato, short, piercing sound, but often stylistically we roll on them. So you'll hear things like this. That kind of thing. So it goes from that range all the way up high. Now we have tubular bells, which are a real character instrument, and they really stand out. They've got a very dense sound. So you got to use them sparingly. A little goes a long way. And we have marimba, which is related to the xylophone. It's another mallet percussion instrument. Goes from C to C, and some larger ones have 4.5 octave or 5 octave range. And again, wooden mallets, and they're a bit softer than xylophone. And stylistically, we often hear rolls. Now, I want to play you a little exercise I've done up, and I've got some of these playing, and I've got some orchestral sounds as well. And first, let's hear this little isolated piece, just featuring and focusing on the characteristics of these instruments. So a little kind of percussion exercise, but here it is in a more musical context with some other instruments. Now I've got bassoon and clarinet playing a legato melody, and I have French horn, violin, and cello, and they're all playing parts that interact with the percussion. So let's listen, and then we'll look at what's going on. So first of all, I have this melody, and this isn't really involved with the percussion. It's just kind of floating over on top. Bassoon and clarinet, so very interesting character. Now here I have the French horn part. And I have that doubled with the Glock. So this is playing staccato, which suits the Glock to help emphasize it. Now here I have violin part. And here it is interacting with the marimba, where again, they're doubling each other, and then the rolls on the marimba in between. And then I have a cello playing some sustained notes. And here I have the marimba doubling this line at the end, an octave, or rather a third higher, harmonizing it. So let's listen to all these. They kind of interact together at the end. One more time. And without the French horn. And finally with the tubular bell. So let's listen to it all one more time now that you've isolated the parts and have a better idea of what's going on. And a little footnote, the clarinet and bassoon part are using some expression in them. So if we look here, you can see the data, and I'll just solo these. and you can sort of get a sense of what the expression is doing. A little swell, swell, swell. Bring it down. So it's very subtle, but adds dynamics to the performance. Here's a little review.